Hello, Giants fans, and welcome to a new edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on YouTube. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. All right, the Giants, of course, on Friday night signed a new quarterback, adding Jameis Winston to their quarterback room. That pretty much caps free agency for the Giants, or the biggest part of free agency, unless something else happens at quarterback, of course. So here to help me break down what the Giants have done, haven't done, what they still need to do, is good friend Patricia Traina of Locked On Giants and New York Giants on SI. Patty, thank you for hopping on.
Of course. Always happy to hop on.
And how about that, Patty? I got it right. Despite the fact that you still haven't fixed your sign, I got it right. It's New York Giants on SI.
Take a bow, my friend.
I shall. All right. So, Patty, we got some late news on Friday night. Giants added Jameis Winston to their quarterback room. So, I kind of liked it. I had advocated for Winston as part of their quarterback room. What did you think of the move, and do you think they're done?
Well, I didn't like the timing of the move. I will confess to that because I ended up having to go through and do another podcast and all the extra stuff. But look, the Giants don't work on our schedule, obviously. But
No, they don't.
that being said, I do like the move. Jameis Winston, look, I know he could be frustrating to watch with the interceptions and stuff, but he also takes chances down the field. And I think that's going to be a big culture shock, if you will, after watching Daniel Jones for almost 6 years. Now, I had gone back and I had looked at the stats of Cedric Tillman and Jerry Jeudy. They had their best yards after the catch, best receiving yardage since, with Winston throwing them the ball. So you think about, okay, what does that mean for Malik Neighbors? What does that mean now for Darius Slayton and Wan'Dale Robinson? It might mean more of the chunk plays that have been missing that the offense has been crying out for. The other thing with Winston, besides the fact that I think he's going to be a hoot and a holler to cover, he's got a great personality, by the way. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but he's got a great personality. This is a point I've made. He is a former first overall draft pick whose career has maybe not gone the way he envisioned it because, he's been relegated to backup roles. So if the Giants were to draft a quarterback at number 3, and I'm not saying they will, I'm not saying they won't, but if they were, you've got a guy like Winston now who can mentor the kid and say, look, this is some of what kind of curtailed my career that you want to avoid. So just that value is there. And look, you look at the contract and it's backup money if you think about it. I mean, name me one other starting quarterback who's appointed a day one starter who's averaging 4 million APY. It just doesn't happen. So I like how they kind of balance the contract out. Now, I haven't seen the exact structure of the contract, but it sounds like what they did with Drew Lock and before him, Tyrod Taylor, which to me says that they're not really done at the position, but they're either waiting out Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson. I think it's Wilson they might be waiting out, but you can't discount Rodgers either.
Are you buying that they're still in the market for Wilson or Rodgers? And I think specifically Wilson because, I mean, I've always hoped it wasn't Rodgers.
Yeah. I am buying that they're waiting it out. I mean, I think what happened here is that they were, it was starting to get late. Before they missed out on somebody, they said, okay, let's get somebody in here. And also you wonder if maybe, although I don't see how this would be perceived as such, but maybe, if you're trying to put the squeeze on one of these guys, you say, hey, we've got Winston. If you don't want to come sign with us or you don't want to agree to our terms, we'll roll with Winston and good luck finding a job elsewhere. Now, in Rodgers' case, he'll land with the Steelers. I'm pretty sure that's where he's going to land. Wilson, I'm not so sure, if he doesn't land with Cleveland, and it doesn't look like that's going to be the case, although again, things can change in an instant, then, Wilson's options are drying out as well, because I'm not so sure he's going to want to go to Minnesota, which is the other team that needs a veteran backup. If Minnesota is all in on JJ McCarthy and just, getting him on the field this year.
Right. I don't think Wilson would go to Minnesota. I think Wilson would want to be a week 1 starter, and he probably gets to do that in New York. He might get to do that in Cleveland. I don't think Kenny Pickett would start over Russell Wilson, but that's probably his options.
Yeah, I just get the sense, look, Wilson, I think, he was, nothing. I know he was interested in the team last year. He wanted to come in and compete to be the starting quarterback. The Giants told him last year, Daniel's our starter once he's healthy. And Russell, I don't blame him for moving on. I don't blame him from going to Pittsburgh, where he competed against Justin Fields. And, for a while he was the starter there. I mean, that's all you want. I mean, most quarterbacks, want that. They want that opportunity to compete to start. And then the guys that kind of, accept the backup role, they're just at that point in their career for whatever the reason. Maybe they didn't work out as a starter or whatever the case might be. So now you don't have Daniel Jones standing in your way if you're Russell Wilson. So if you can make the money work with the Giants, you do it. You come in, you're guaranteed to be the week 1 starter, assuming that you're healthy, and you just roll from there.
Yeah, I think these guys have to understand at this point in their careers that these teams are going to protect themselves. They're going to draft young guys. So that's part of the deal, mentoring a young guy. And that's something that Wilson's reputation seems to be, that he's willing to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Wilson, is he an ideal fit for what the Giants do? You could find that you can nitpick and say he's not quite what they want, but would he be the type of guy who would maybe win you some games? I think he would. And you're right. I think he would be a good influence in the locker room, not just in the quarterback room, but with the receivers and, the rest of the offense, the rest of the team. And, I don't think Russell Wilson would necessarily create headlines like, maybe some other guys would.
No, the bottom line, though, is he's maybe diminished from what he was a few years ago, but he's still better than what the Giants have had at quarterback over the last few years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they need an upgrade at the position. And, I don't know if you could say Winston is necessarily an upgrade. I think he's a little bit better in some areas, but there are areas that concern me still. But
mostly that he likes to score points for both teams.
Exactly. But look, every quarterback I know throws interceptions, and it's how you respond to it. We saw Daniel Jones for the 6 years he was here. He was throwing turnovers, and then Joe Judge got in his ear and basically, said to him, don't make mistakes, don't take chances. But if you don't take a chance, how do you know if it's going to be an interception or if it's going to be a long touchdown? You don't know. So that's kind of the trade-off with Jameis Winston. You have to take the good with the bad with him if he ends up being your starter.
That's true. Patty, let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the rest of free agency and where the roster stands, as we sort of turn the corner. Obviously there might still be a big quarterback move, but other than that, free agency for the Giants is mostly done. What have you really liked about what they've done in free agency? And is there anything they haven't done that's been a surprise to you?
Well, I like that they addressed the defensive secondary. I think I've said many times that safety going into free agency was a sneaky need, and it was. A lot of people said to me, well, what about Dane Belton? If Jason Pinnock leaves, Dane Belton. And I'm like, not enough depth. So I think, addressing that with Javon Holland, good move. Bringing in Paulson Adebo, was he my first choice? No, but I don't hate the move. I would have liked DJ Reed or maybe even Carlton Davis, but I don't hate the move. I like that they added veteran defensive line depth, which they desperately needed. I mean, no disrespect to the rookies and young guys that they had playing out the season last year, but like I've said so many times before, Dexter Lawrence can't do it all by himself. As good as he is not, he can't do it all by himself. And I think they brought in some guys that can help him. On the offensive line, hallelujah, they gave up apparently on this idea of having Joshua Azudu as their swing tackle. They got guys in here who can play tackle left and right. So that experiment finally seems to be over. And only 1 year too late, in my opinion. So I like that move. What they haven't done yet, obviously they've got to resolve the right guard situation. They brought back Greg Van Roten, but that they were looking at bringing in an upgrade at that spot, but the prices might have turned them off a little bit. So I don't think that position on the offensive line is set. I think you want to find a nice young 3 technique to line up next to Dexter Lawrence if you can. That can maybe be the future. He and Lawrence as the starters. And otherwise, it's just basically filling in depth. But, other than, and I didn't mention the quarterback, which is obviously still a problem. But yeah, as far as the rest of the roster goes, that's, kind of how I see it.
And I do think, Patty, a lot of times the free agency is a little bit of a tell sometimes as to, you don't want to say that a team is definitely going to draft at this position or that position, but sometimes it's a little bit of a tell of what they think of what might be available in the draft. If you look at what the Giants did in free agency, what does it tell you about what the draft plans might be?
I think I would have to question if they plan to draft a quarterback in the first round. Now, if they sign Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers, I can pretty much say they're not going to draft a quarterback in the first round, or at least not at number 3, I should say. Could they potentially trade back up into the first round, like try and get ahead of Pittsburgh to maybe get their guy to develop? Possibly, but look, this is a team that needs to win games. They need to show that they're making progress week over week in the coming season. So they're going to need their first 3 rounds of picks. They've got 4 picks in the first 3 rounds. They're going to need those guys to come in and hit the ground running. And, I don't want to say that they won't draft a quarterback this year because, I would take a flyer somewhere if I were them. But I just don't know that it's going to be at 3. I am not so sure if there's, if you don't take one at 3, are you really going to trade back up into the bottom of the first round? Or is that considered a reach, to take a quarterback, so that you could get him on the 5-year plan?
Look, if they could perhaps get up to number 1 and get Cam Ward, I think they might do that. But I don't know about giving up assets to move back into the first round. So, I mean, do you agree with me, or do you think they would move up to number 1 if Tennessee was willing to move down?
That's a tough one. I mean, look, the Giants were all set to trade away assets to get Matthew Stafford, which, as we know, that trade didn't happen. I suspect that they will not look to trade up with the Titans. Now, obviously, if they're going to do that, the target would be Cam Ward. I don't think, because again, you need your picks to hit the ground running. And I know that people are probably thinking, well, that's short-sighted. But this regime, unlike Washington last year, who had new ownership, a new head coach, a new GM, they had room for error. This regime does not. They're in year 4. They've got to hit the ground running in 2025. And, could they justify saying, okay, you know what? We really don't have first round grades on these guys. We don't want to reach. Let's just wait till next year and take a quarterback next year. I could see that being a possibility. I know it won't be the most popular direction that they take, but the danger here with Joe, and this is kind of why I was like surprised, if you will, that they were kept. The danger now becomes, do they do anything rash that, to ensure that they have a lifeline, as opposed to, staying true to their processes that they talk about so often, and their board that Joe says he listens to. So that's really the big, question mark, because as we get closer to the draft and we don't have an answer from Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers, is there going to be a sense of panic at that point?
Right. This is one thing that I have said, and I supported the idea of keeping Joe and Brian Daboll, but you do put yourself in an awkward situation because you're 100% right. There's heat on them in 2025. And I go back to listening to Joe at the combine. Again and again and again, Joe referenced best quarterback for 2025, winning in 2025, doing what's best for 2025. He never talked about the future because he knows that he and Daboll don't have a future with the Giants unless 2025 is better. I think, just see if you agree with this, you would like for your GM to be able to think about the long term. But I don't think Joe can think long term right now. I think, his priorities got to be 2025. It's got to be whatever he can do to win this year. To his credit, I think he hasn't done anything rash to this point. He hasn't thrown money around like crazy. He didn't trade away his entire draft class. So to his credit, I don't think he's done anything outlandish. But for Joe and Brian Daboll, it has to be all about 2025. You agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And, would they trade away assets in 2026? They might, maybe, a day 3, maybe, even a third rounder if they need to move up. But, I don't, that's why I'm not so sure this talk about trading up with the Titans was ever realistic. Although that said, they were willing to apparently trade assets for Matthew Stafford that included 2026. But that was a different situation because, Stafford, you get him, he would have been your starter, for however long his contract ran.
Right.
And, they didn't get him, obviously. So now they've got to pivot. And, the bottom line, Ed, is they should have taken a quarterback last year when they had the chance, even if they took a flyer on somebody. Joe Milton, Spencer Rattler. I still to this day don't understand why they did not take a flyer on somebody in a lot of rounds. Now, I realize that would have meant maybe you don't get a Tyrone Tracy or a Darius Mawasso or maybe a Theo Johnson. I get that, but that decision, oh, that's really coming back to bite them, I think.
Yeah, I've said it before, Patty. It's not what the Giants did in the 2024 draft. You look at each one of the players that they drafted, and they drafted good players. It's what they didn't do. And I've said it before, whether it was Milton or whether it was Rattler. Once they moved on from Daniel Jones last year, those last 6 or 7 games would have been really interesting if you were turning the thing over to a young quarterback and letting him show you whether you needed to be in the quarterback market this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'd be curious. I know people have asked Joe do you regret it? And he has said no. But what do you expect him to say?
He can't say anything else.
He can't say anything else. But I gotta think he does regret it. You know, when you have a deep class and you know that, you know, I mean, look, we learned on Hard Knocks, and that's going to forever haunt Joe, I think. But they were all set to trade up to get Jaden Daniels or Drake May. If that didn't tell you right then and there that they were looking to move on from Daniel Jones, I don't know what else would. So why they decided, again, not to take a flyer on a quarterback on day 3, it just doesn't compute for me. And maybe I'm missing something. I don't know. But I just don't see the logic.
Yeah, and it still bothers me. Look, Malik Neighbors is a wonderful player. But Malik Neighbors needs a quarterback. And I get it. He's a great player. Brian Daboll really wanted him. You could see that, you know, from Hard Knocks, of course. But you had your choice of 3 guys, and they chose none. They chose none of the above. And that's a decision that may still haunt them. And, you know, if they don't get their guy this time around, you know, then Joe and Brian Daboll are going to get fired without ever really getting their guy.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. And, you know, again, Joe has his reasons, and I get it. Listen to the board. But he talks about all these processes that they have. What have those processes gotten him? 2 losing records in a row, including a franchise worst 3-14. Do you think maybe if they're not working, maybe you gotta rethink what you're doing here and make adjustments?
Well, the bothersome thing for me, Patty, was to listen to Joe say, I believe in taking swings at quarterback. So what swings has he taken? Because I'm not sure I count Daniel Jones as a swing.
No.
Daniel Jones was already there, and after 2022, there was no choice but to re-sign Daniel Jones. I'm not sure Jameis Winston is really a swing. So if he believes in taking swings, what swing has he taken?
None, if you think about it.
And so you can't keep saying we have this great process and we believe in taking swings without taking a swing.
Exactly. And you know, that's why I don't understand. You know, look, usually I can see the logic on what they're doing, even if I don't agree with it. I do not see the logic here at all. At all. I mean, they put it out on TV for everybody to see, so it's not like we're making this up here.
Yeah.
So I just don't understand what they're doing here with the positions and these processes that they talk about. Obviously, like I said, they haven't worked the last 2 years. Maybe change something up. You know,
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's not just quarterback, Patty. You and I have talked about it a lot. There have been, over the last 2 years in particular, there have been a lot of head scratching things that you just, you know, why are they constructing the roster that way? Why are they taking that chance? Why aren't they filling that hole? And I get that they feel like they have a process, but it hasn't led them to good results.
No, it hasn't. And when it doesn't, you change something. You know, don't you know, what's that saying about insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results?
Yeah, and this is pretty much last stand time for Joe and Brian.
Mm-hmm.
So, Patty, before I let you go, if if I if I have you look in your crystal ball, which quarterback are the Giants going to draft? And well, which quarterback are they going to draft? It's two-part question. Which quarterback are they going to draft? And who's taking snaps week 1 for the Giants at quarterback?
Ooh, wow. That is a tough one. And I say that's tough because if they sign Russell Wilson or Aaron Rodgers, I'm not sure they take a quarterback on day 1 or day 2. I think maybe they take somebody on day 3. But even that's not a slam dunk. Because presumably if you sign Rodgers and or Wilson, you're talking at least a 2-year deal. So you've got Winston for 2 years, and now you've got one of those guys for 2 years. So you really don't need a quarterback this year. But that being said, I would still take a swing on somebody. So the quarterback that I think is going to start week 1 based on what they have now is Winston until further notice, until, we hear if Rodgers is coming or if Wilson's coming. If one of those guys is coming, they're the starter week 1. It's not going to be a rookie. This is going to be the same setup they wanted to have last year, where they wanted to get a rookie in here. They weren't able to trade up, but the plan was to get a rookie in here and let Daniel Jones and Drew Lock handle the heavy lifting while the kids sat. So, in an ideal world, and I hate to say this because, look, take a swing, I get it. Better off to take a swing when the class is a little deeper and maybe you're going to find what you want, as opposed to having to force a pick on a guy that you maybe isn't an exact pick or a fit for what you do, other than the fact that he plays a position that you desperately need.
Yeah, the problem's going to be for Joe and Brian. The problem's going to be if they don't take some sort of a swing this year, they may never get one.
Well, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, would you rather they take a quarterback and then, if they don't make it to to 2026, now the new GM and the new head coach inherits the guy that was custom picked by that guy? I mean, it's the same cycle that we talked about. I mean, it's what happened to Joe and Ryan when they came in here. They inherited somebody else's quarterback.
Yep.
They tried to make it work. And that's not to say that you can't make it work, but it's not the best way to build for the long term.
No, it's not. All right, Patty, I appreciate the time, appreciate all the insight. And folks, check out Patty over on the Locked On Giants podcast and New York Giants on SI. When, for whatever reason, you get tired of reading my stuff or listening to my stuff. So anyway, Patty, thanks again. Giants fans, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there, take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.